Okay, welcome back, Peter.
Yeah,
The
good to
usual
be
intro.
back. Yeah.
um, okay, so I'm gonna do the book summary, and then we can start digging into it. But it's episode 28, and we are reading, or we read through The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm. So I'll give a quick book summary. So, The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm argues that one of the core problems we face as humans is that of separateness. The solution, he suggests, is unity achieved through love, not merely a feeling, but an art, the result of an active, productive orientation of one's character. Fromm suggests that, as with learning any art, learning to love begins with understanding the theory, followed by mastering the practice. The book starts with the theory of love and concludes with the steps towards mastering its practice. Yeah, I don't know if you have any additional comments there or initial thoughts on the book. I know we were chatting a tiny bit beforehand.
Yeah. Not much. I think it's just highlighting what you're saying. It's like uh, the humans try to overcome the whole separatedness. Yeah. I think um, it was I mean, an interesting way of framing it in the sense that maybe I just never thought about it in that sense. But yeah,
Yeah,
it was kind of a good way to lay it out, I guess.
yeah, yeah. I think it's I mean, it's somewhat obvious, but also somewhat
Yeah.
novel. It's like at the same time. Um, but I like the idea of saying like, okay, there's like a theory element to it and a practical element to it. Um, but yeah, I think also something that we are chatting a little bit about was just that it was quite a difficult book to read. Um, I don't know why exactly. Like it's we mentioned a little bit of the layout, and I'm not sure if that's the layout of the book was difficult to read because we're just not used to reading that kind of a book, or if it's just
The
yeah, the way
writing.
that From structures it. But yeah, I definitely found it. Even so, we picked it because we were like, okay, we both in a bit of a crunch time, and let's do a shorter book. And this one, and then it turns out that I don't know. For me, it was not a short read. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I don't know. I don't like in the sense of like not sure that like I kind of I probably read it in like 3 sittings. If I'm to be,
that's impressive.
yeah, 3 to 4 sittings. But it's that thing where you'd start reading and you kind of get lost to be like, there's just a
Yeah,
lot more accompanying text that I would think wasn't necessary to be there with the point that it was trying to put across. So in that regard, maybe, yeah, but I do get you in the sense that it probably maybe in those settings it took me a lot longer to cover 10 pages than it would have to cover 10 pages of a different book.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I
Well, it
think it was
definitely
also
did for me.
yeah, and maybe it's also just my take. I felt like the beginning was better, the end was worse. I think
Interesting.
um, yeah, the ending for me, I think again, he probably even said it. It's as if he started off and was like, oh, I don't have time to do all this. And then if you realize the other parts of the practical bits was like, I'll explain the one, the others are kind of just skim over them. Which I
Hmm.
also felt like they were equally as important for him to spend as much more time expanding on that. So to me, it was kind of like, okay, I don't get it, but I mean, as human, I'm like, it's part of that lazy tech of like you start doing something and then you're like, okay, it's crunch time. I need to just get something out. That was just my feeling for it. But yeah,
It's interesting because I felt kind of the opposite.
oh, is
I
it?
I actually enjoyed the ending, but I think it was because at the beginning I was really okay, the entry point to the book, like the preface, I really
Yeah,
liked. It's like
yeah,
super clean and simple, and I'll read through a little bit of the preface, but I really liked the way that he framed the preface. And then when he starts to dig into it, I got so lost.
yeah.
Now I'm not lost anymore, but I got like super lost. So I had like this initial burst of like, cool, this is great. Then
Yeah.
this dip of like, oh man, this is so difficult, and like I don't know what I'm reading, and like, is there even a point to anything he's saying? And then I was running into points that I was like kind of disagreeing with, and
Yeah.
then towards the end, I was like, oh, okay, I think I get kind of where I don't fully agree with absolutely everything, but I think I agree with the majority of what he said. And,
Okay, so
and at the end, I was like, I like the way I like the points were kind of obvious to some degree, but I think that's with most things when everything's obvious in retrospect towards the end.
so correction. I didn't say that I didn't enjoy the last bit. Or didn't like the last.
It
I'm
was
trying.
compressed, if that's what
Anyway,
you were saying.
that's what
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
trying to say.
No,
To be
definitely
like
it was compressed. I think it was
that's
like
what.
20 pages compared to the rest was like 80 pages or something.
Not only that, but even in that compression, what he did was like he spoke so much of the one section, and then kind of skimmed over the other points. That was what I was getting at. So to me,
Yeah.
I was like,
Okay.
either I could have kept it consistent to be like, I'll just speak briefly about everything else, or put equally as much time in all the other points. I don't know if that makes sense. So I'm not saying that I didn't get I struggled to read the book in its and I've explained like why. But yeah, like I know the middle section was a bit like, okay, oh, what's going on here? And I think also it was what he used to title some of the sections and how what was spoken about in it was kind of like, huh, like yes, I guess maybe you have to encapsulate the things into something, but I was like, I don't know if I'll do it in that way. But yeah,
Yeah.
like you're saying, there like some things you're like, okay, I agree with some. You're like, I'm not too sure, but I guess maybe that's also um what a good book is. If it's thought provoking, then
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I the way that he reached certain conclusions and stuff, similar to what you were saying now, I wouldn't have gotten to
I
those in
mean,
the same way as he did.
mm,
And some of the conclusions I don't think I would have reached. And now I'm like, oh, maybe that is a logical way of viewing it. Um, but yeah, I think it's done in a very interesting way, and like you say, maybe it's in some sense the sign of a good book to be that it sort of challenges you. What I'm interested in as well is that on the cover it says. So I mean, I don't think I had really heard of this book from anyone. I don't know where we came across it, but so I obviously heard it from someone. But I don't. It's to me, it's not in the like current cultural popular books. But it says on the cover that it's an international bestseller. So I assume like earlier on when Fromm was still alive and that it was quite a popular book of his. And if that's the case, I wonder if a lot of people read it or if it's just like a book that was bought for the title. Um, yeah, but and what all those people thought of it if they did read it. But anyway, we don't have infinite time, so should
yeah,
we dig into the preface and then go from there?
yeah, yeah. We can.
Cool. We're gonna follow the classic flow. I'm just gonna read a little snippet, then we'll chat through it, and then we'll go on to the next section. Okay, so just a high level overview of the way that the book is structured. So first, as mentioned, talks about the theory part of it, and then he talks about the practical part, and then there's some other stuff intermingled, which we'll sort of glance over. Um, but those are the two main portions. And then at the beginning, he starts off with a preface, and then the next chapter that we'll see is the art. I mean, is love an art? So he's basically asking the question, which his answer is obviously yes. But we can chat a little bit through that. Okay, so the preface on page VII. Thank you, Roman numerals.
7,
Um,
James. 7.
I'm not gonna even
I
try.
know.
I don't even know if I can trust you that it's 7. I think it is
it,
because V is 5 and II is 2, so you're
it
probably
is
right.
7,
But
James.
okay, 7, page 7. Um, he says, this book wants to show that love is not a sentiment which can be easily indulged by anyone, regardless of the level of maturity reached by him. It wants to convince the reader that all his attempts for love are bound to fail, unless he tries most actively to develop his total personality so as to achieve a productive orientation. That satisfaction in individual love cannot be attained without the capacity to love one's neighbor, without true humility, courage, faith, and discipline. Yeah, I think, I don't know about you, but I can tell why I liked the initial chapter. I think it's a really good summary of the idea of what love is, where it's not about some very specific thing. It's about the totality of one's like character. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Peter?
Yeah, no. Again, I think there was also quite a bit of like linking between character and love and what needs to be done, to sort of achieve love. So no, I agree. And I mean, I think just to add, it's not. I don't think it was covered in the preface, but later on it kind of says, to be a good artist or artisan or whatever it is, it takes practice.
Mm.
So it's just, we also have to understand that it's not just something that comes naturally, but there's certain things you have to harn to sort of, better the way you actually love. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that's not exactly what you meant, but you said to achieve love, and I think that that's not something like love isn't some end goal,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's more um a continued thing. And as you develop your character, you are able to love more, but it's not like I get into a relationship and now I finally achieved love. I know that that's not what you
Yeah.
were saying, but
Yeah.
just for
Yeah. Yeah.
clarification.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Cool. Um, okay, so should we go on to the next one? Is love an art? I'm gonna jump through some quotes quick. So, page 1, back from page 7. This is actually forward, but yeah. So page 1, is love an art? Then it requires knowledge and effort, or is love a pleasant sensation, which to experience is a matter of chance, something one falls into if one is lucky. This little book is based on the former premise, while undoubtedly the majority of people today believe in the latter. Then a little bit further down, this particular attitude is based on several premises which either singly or combined tend to uphold it. Most people see the problem of love primarily as that of being loved, rather than that of loving, of one's capacity to love. Then on page 2, a second premise behind the attitude that there is nothing to be learnt about love is the assumption that the problem of love is the problem of an object, not the problem of a faculty. People think that to love is simple, but that to find the right object to love or to be loved by is difficult. And then on page 3, in fact, they take the intensity of the infatuation, this being crazy about each other, for proof of the intensity of their love, while it may only prove the degree of their preceding loneliness. And then on 4, so what are the necessary steps to learning any art if this is an art? And then he says the process of learning an art can be divided conveniently into 2 parts. 1, mastery of the theory, and the other mastery of the practice. Then he says, when I have all this theoretical knowledge, I am by no means competent in the art of medicine. I shall become a master of this art only after a great deal of practice, until eventually the result of my theoretical knowledge and the result of my practice are blended into one intuition, in the essence of mastery of any art. Yeah. So that's the first sort of section. Just asking, is it reasonable to be like, love is an art? And then he kind of argues that most people in at his time, the current culture or contemporary culture, and I would say the same thing is true of our current culture, where a lot of people will be like, it's about the feeling of love. And he's saying, no, that's not the primary thing. You see later on, that's not that he negates it and is like, no, it doesn't have anything to do with the feeling at all, but his focus is on the act and the art of loving and the mastery of that, rather than on this, like, relying on this feeling.
And I think not only that, it's kind of, I want to say, the root of that act. I don't know if I'm making sense there, but he, in the way he's kind of, he explained like the different kinds of love, and I know we'll get there. Like, for instance, motherly love. He kind of says like that is even loving something you've never seen. It's like the whole thing of that. How is it that, and again, that sort of relates to how mothers love over time, and in terms of fathers, in the sense that instinctively, even like for something that they've never seen, a newborn that has never even showed towards love, for them, they're able to unconditionally love a baby, Yet they say then that differs to fatherly love in the sense that it, I mean, as you said, like, the feeling is always there of love, but it's like what's in the book is trying to say, like, how people love as in the form of an art, in terms of what it is they know. And so, yeah, the reason I'm bringing that now is like what I've explained about mother love. The difference with fatherly love is then that it seems more of like a transactional thing, to be like, if you've done something that makes a father proud, kind of then is proportionate to how much he loves you. The moment you disappoint him, then they sort of retract, and you feel like they're not giving you that love, or they're not showing that love. So yeah, it's more of, again, like you said, not something that's not achieved, but like a practice, how the different parties practice love, and again, it's just, again, in terms of like art, not all artists are the same. There are different categories in which artists sort of fall under, and since love is an art, there are also then different categories of loving, essentially.
Yeah. It's a good way of phrasing it. So then are we going to head to the theory of love? So this is obviously the biggest chunk, and it covers there's a bunch of subcategories under the theory of love, and some subcategories under the subcategories. But the three main sort of sections that he gives is one, so, and all under the theory of love. One is love, the answer to the problem of human existence. And then he says love between parents and child. And then he goes on to the objects of love, which is brotherly love, motherly love, erotic, self-love, and love of God. So those three, and then a bunch of little looking into different objects of love and that. So we'll look at, starting on page 6, love, the answer to the problem of human existence. So he starts off here and he says, man is gifted with reason. He is life being aware of itself. This awareness of himself as a separate entity, the awareness of his own short lifespan, of the fact that without his will he is born, and against his will he dies, that he will die before those whom he loves, or they before him. The awareness of his loneliness and aloneness and separateness, of his helplessness before the forces of nature and society, all this makes his separate, disunited existence an unbearable prison. Then a little bit further to page 8. The deepest need of man, then, is the need to overcome his separateness, to leave the prison of his aloneness. And then a little bit further down. So now he sort of goes over how he understands the flow of where we are as humans in relation to our separation, and like what the different stages are of being separated. And he says here, only a limited number of answers have been given. The history of religion and philosophy is the history of these answers. The answers depend to some extent on the degree of individuation which an individual has reached. In infantness, he still feels one with his mother. His sense of aloneness is cured by the physical presence of the mother. Then the next is to the degree that the child develops a sense of separateness and individuality, is the physical presence of the mother not sufficient anymore, and then the need to overcome the separateness in other ways arises. So we first have the mother, and you sort of born connected to the mother in general, obviously, and then that satisfies that anxiety of separateness. And then as you become an individual and you sort of realize that, oh, I'm separate from my mother, that separation starts to eat away at you, and you now need to start coming to other ways of dealing with that separation. And then he carries on and he says, similarly, the human race in its infancy feels one with nature. The soil, animals, plants are still man's world. He identifies himself with animals, and this is expressed by wearing, he gets into wearing of animal masks and different things. But the point is that in some sense there's a parallel within nature, that we are connected to it in the same way as a mother to a child. And then he carries on to say, but the more the human race emerges from these primary bonds, these sort of motherly bonds, the more it separates itself from the natural world, and the more intense becomes the need to find ways of escaping this separateness. And then he's, over the next couple pages, he goes on to different ways of escaping that separateness. So I'll give the three different ways he gives initially. The first way is, and it's a sort of weird term, orgiastic states. And by that he kind of, like, it's an unhelpful term in our current context, because like we generally think of one thing, but what he's kind of getting at is trance-like euphoric states. So you can think of things like drugs, but also obviously sex and things like that. So those kind of different states, those like euphoric states, are one way of solving the problem of this separateness. But then we'll see, he basically says those states are transitory, like they're fleeting. They quick and then they dissipate. You can think taking drugs, you feel a high and then the high is gone. Then the next, we'll see in a second, he goes to the conformity of the group, which is one of the most common ways that we deal with it. So we have this separateness issue, and then we basically start to conform with different groups, whether it's conforming with the way that your friend group does things to fit in and so on. And he says that is a type of unity, but it's sort of a pseudo unity. It's not really like very real unity. And then he says another way that people try and solve it is by creative activity. But the problem that he kind of gets to there is that creativity it's not interpersonal. So it's not normally between people. It's normally you creating something. Obviously there's exceptions to that and so on, but yeah. So just to kind of scan through, he says, and I'm going to replace the word with euphoric states. He says, one way of achieving this aim lies in kind of euphoric states. These may have the form of an auto-induced trance, sometimes with the help of drugs. Many rituals from primitive tribes offer a vivid picture of this type of solution. Then onto the next page, page 10. All forms of this euphoric union have three characteristics. They are intense, even sometimes violent. They occur in total personality, the mind and the body, and they are transitory and periodical. Then the second is the exact opposite, holds true, exactly the opposite holds true for that form of union, which is by far the most common, far the most frequent solution chosen by man in past and present, the union based on conformity with the group, its customs, its practices, and its beliefs. And then going on to page 13, union by conformity is not intense and violent, it's calm and dictated by routine, and for this very reason is often insufficient to pacify the anxiety of separateness. The incidence of alcoholism, drug addiction, compulsive sexualism, and suicide in contemporary Western society are symptoms of this relative failure of herd conformity. So he's basically saying, like, it's a solution, but it's not the right solution. And then he gives the third solution. The third way of attaining union lies in creative activity, be it that of the artist or of the artisan. Any kind of creative work, the creating person unites himself with his material, which represents the world outside of himself. In all other types of work, the object has become, in all types of creative work, the worker and his object have become one. The man unites himself with the world in the process of this creation. This, however, holds true only for productive work, for work which I plan and produce and see the result of. In the modern work process of a clerk, the worker on an endless belt, little is left of the uniting quality of work. And then he says, the unity achieved in productive work or true creative activity is not interpersonal. The unity achieved... I know I'm not reading that in the most clear way. So he's given these three different sort of states or ways of dealing with separation, and he basically is going to conclude now that none of them are ideal, and these are the reasons why they're not ideal, which is kind of what I've said previously. So he says, the unity achieved in the creative act is not interpersonal. The unity achieved in the euphoric fusion is transitory, and the unity achieved by conformity is only unity. Hence, they are all only partial answers to the problem of existence. The full answer lies in the achievement of interpersonal union, of fusion with another person in love. So, essentially kind of gets to the point of saying none of these answers fully satisfy the problem of separation. Love is the answer. And then he kind of carries on with that. And then I'll pause there and we can chat about that, and then I'll go on to the next little bit. So what are your thoughts, Peter?
Sorry, just clear my throat. Yeah, no, it's quite interesting to actually sort of see some of these highlights in society. I think um again, now you speaking to them, I think I'm just when I was reading them, my brain was, I think, reading to read, and not as, what the intent of it was. But I kind of, I'm back now. But yeah, it's interesting
It was a
to,
difficult one to like follow.
eh, yeah. Again, we have said that it was, yeah, quite one of those challenges to read. But yeah, it's interesting to see how those different factors present in modern society. For instance, like, and I mean, he kind of talks about it, about how we've become a world that treats everything in accordance to like the economy. How everything you do, or as a person, you kind of associate value to it, and like, yeah, like, what do I put in, to get something from it? And it's like, unfortunately, that's what people also are associated love with, you know but yeah, just to go back to the three states, it's interesting that, again, like, I mean, you've changed the term, like, we look at like the euphoric state, like, people are trying to fill a void, which is, again, like I said, it's something we know, but was pointed in or framed in a different way, that it's separatedness, like, you want to feel close to someone,
Mm.
or to something. And interesting enough, that's what people do, when they don't want an escape, they'll, run to drugs, and in that they'll probably have a a community. I don't like, but
Yeah.
our use community that also does drugs, and they get a sense of belonging, and that's like something they've picked up, and to them their end goal is to feel sense of belonging, but not realizing that what's actually keeping them together is not the most ideal, not great, and I
Yeah.
mean, it happens, how, I mean, we label it as outgrowing friendships, but it's in those sense that there was something euphoric that drew you guys closer. Either you don't identify with that anymore, and you then like, okay, let me take a step back, you know. Yeah, so that's just my take on that. I mean, in terms of like the uh, conformity state, that as well, I mean, during COVID, there was that buzzword to head mentality and stuff. But I mean, that's a real thing, people will, I mean, ideally, they would present it as they are the ones that have thought of doing this thing, but it's been heavily influenced by seeing people around them, Um, I mean, there's a book that we read that you are a sum of the characters of the people you hang around.
Mm.
That's what makes you conform, because you relate to these people in a certain thing, or you like, certain things that they do. You're like, oh, let me also conform to that, in the hopes that, you fill that void,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
overcome
I'm a
that.
part of something. Yeah.
Yeah, it fills that void, or you've been separate to something, yeah, and then the art one, which I think that was the last one,
Or creative acts. Yeah.
creative acts, which was very, again, now that I'm like thinking about it, but it's like, you kind of, it's and correct me, if I'm wrong, but it's also like feeding one's ego, in the sense of, I have to create something or rather, because I've created this, I should like this, But again, like I said,
No,
it's sorry.
no, I'm saying yeah hesitantly.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
there are of course elements of that and elements
yeah.
of, but yeah, carry on with your
Uh,
thought.
yeah, no, and I think the reason why I brought that in as well is because I don't know if you in the last chapters you kind of say we all have a degree of narcissism, and we most often look at it how am I loved, and I mean it's something that you spoke to in the first place. You know,
Yeah,
it's
the
about
intro.
the inward love instead of the outward love, but so yeah, what I'm getting at here again, like I said, that was probably rich. But what I'm trying to say is in the sense of you kind of say like or put it in your head that if I created this, I have to love it, you know, because that's how um in the end you sort of get hurt by criticism. And but again, that's just like high level. I'm
Yeah,
not like just
I,
diving
I don't.
into yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that that's what he's saying, but I think that is true. Like you can end up in that cycle of like creating things and being like, I'm the best. This
Mm,
is amazing creation, and then if other people don't like it, you're like, oh, but it's
mm,
nice. But I think what he's saying is more like creativity and a true creative act, because he often uses this term of like a productive orientation, which is he uses it in a fairly specific way, where he's like it's work that is producing something good almost, rather than just like doing work for the sake of work. And I think he's saying like if you create something, if you do productive work, like true creative activity, then it can be really great. And you can be like, this is wonderful and that, but it doesn't solve the problem completely. It's only a partial solution. So it's not even that. So in this specific instance, he's not even viewing it on the negative side. He's not saying like
yeah.
it's a bad thing. He's just
Mm,
saying like it's not the full solution. It can't be,
yeah.
because when you're creating, you're normally creating individually. But again, there's arguments to be made that because you create in work and you create in relationships and do different things. So I don't, yeah, I don't think his argument is fully fleshed out, but that's the nature of life. Yeah. Should we go on to the next little bit? So it's still in the sort of subsection, the answer to the problem of human existence is love. He's slowly sort of building up that point. And then he makes a nice sort of almost caveat here. He says, on page 15, he says, as with all semantic difficulties, the answer can only be arbitrary when talking about like what exactly is love. What matters is that we know what kind of union we are talking about when we speak of love. So he's basically just saying, let's define what we're talking about when we're speaking about love for the rest of this book. And then he gives two different things. He basically gives this idea of immature love and the idea of mature love. And then he splits immature love into two different sub things. The one is like a passive thing and the one is an active thing, but both of them are not good. So the 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 parts of immature love, he says, can go one of two ways. One is masochism, where you like kind of controlling someone else. So if you're in a relation, where you're controlled. So if you're in a relationship and you kind of just basically think the other person is the best thing ever, and you'll do absolutely anything that they say, and then that's what he's saying is one way immature love can go. And the other way is that you can be on the flip side of that. You can be the controlling one. And both of those are not great. And that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about love, which I think is fairly obvious. Um, and then he says that we refer to love as the mature form, essentially. And then on page 16, he says, In contrast to immature union, mature love is union under the condition of preserving one's integrity, one's individuality. Then a little bit further, in love, the paradox occurs that two beings become one and yet remain two. So it's a little maybe a bit confusing of a point, but the core idea is that he gives this concept of immature love, and immature love, in neither of those cases, if you are the one being controlled or if you are the one controlling, in neither of those cases are you upholding the idea of integrity. And he's saying that that's kind of the core distinction between immature love and mature love. Mature love has this element of integrity where it's only with sort of mature or true love, only with integrity can that love be good or correct or yeah. It's a sort of quick nuanced thing, but I don't know if you have any other things to touch on there.
Yeah, even reading on some of the section, the three, as you said, the passive where you submissive, the active where you're the dominant, and those last, which was the sadistic, Again, it's things that we see all around us, and they always bring up questions and whatnot. But yeah, like you said, I think I would almost say it's like what people have conformed to, but as he's saying, it's not, the best, like you're saying, the paradox was confusing. He kind of was like, if A is A, there exists another A. That A is not the first A. Yeah. So yeah. Again, like you're saying, it's that whole thing of where looking inwardly you'd be like, oh, there's a problem there, but I think you did also mention like the people within this have no problem with it. Yeah.
Yeah. The transition he makes now is a little bit of a funny one. I don't really understand it, but it makes sense what he's saying. I just don't understand the transition. So on page 17, he shifts towards the idea of like giving and how love is this act of giving. So he says, in the most general way, the active character of love can be described by stating that love is primarily giving, not receiving. And then he goes to page 19. In the sphere of material things, giving means being rich. Not he who has much is rich, but he who gives much. The hoarder is anxiously worried about losing something. Psychologically speaking, they are the poor, impoverished man, regardless of how much they have. And then a little bit further down, the most important sphere of giving, however, is not that of material things, but lies in the specifically human realm. He gives of himself, of the most precious gift he has, he gives of his life. And then he goes on to say not necessarily sacrificing your life and things like that, but just sort of giving of yourself. And then on page 20, it's hardly necessary to stress the fact that the ability to love as an act of giving depends on the character development of the person. It presupposes the attainment of a predominantly productive orientation. So to produce rather than to take. It's that term that he's using again. In this orientation, the person has overcome the dependency, the narcissistic omnipotence, the wish to exploit others or to hoard, and has acquired faith in his own human powers, courage to rely on his powers in the attainment of his goals. To the degree that these qualities are lacking, he is afraid of giving of himself, and hence of loving. And then, so he discusses that giving is one of those core elements of loving. And then he goes on to discuss 4 basic elements common in all the different types or forms of love. And he says there on page 21, the basic elements common to all forms of love are care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. And then he carries on to say, it's not different even with the love for animals or flowers. Sorry, let me jump back one little bit. The love that implies care is most evident in the mother's love for her child. It is not different even with the love for animals or flowers. If a woman told us that she loved flowers and we saw that she forgot to water them, we would not believe her in her love for the flowers. Love is an active concern for the life and the growth of that which we love. Where this active concern is lacking, there is no love. So that's the care part. And then he goes on to say, responsibility. Today, responsibility is often meant to denote duty, something imposed upon us from the outside. But responsibility, in its true sense, is an entirely voluntary act. It is my response to the needs expressed or unexpressed of another human being. To be responsible means to be able and ready to respond. The loving person responds. The life of his brother is not his brother's business alone, but it is his own. And then the next thing, responsibility could easily deteriorate into dominion and possessiveness if it were not for the third component of love, respect. Respect is not fear and awe. It denotes in accordance with the root of the word, and then respecir, or something like that, which means to look at, the ability to see a person as he is. And then he goes on, it is clear that respect is possible only if I have achieved independence. So that goes back to the mature idea of love that we were speaking about, where he mentions the idea of independence and of, there was another I word and now I'm blanking on it, but anyway. And then point 4, to respect a person is not possible without knowing him. Care and responsibility would be blind if they were not guided by knowledge. Knowledge would be empty if it were not motivated by concern. There are many layers of knowledge. I may know, for instance, that a person is angry, but I know that his anger is only the manifestation of something deeper, and I see in him an anxiousness and embarrassment that is as a suffering person rather than an angry one. Then lastly on 25, care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge are mutually interdependent. They are a syndrome of attitudes which are to be found in the mature person. Yeah. Don't know if you have any comments there. Cool. Yeah, I think like by the end of that chapter, I'm on the same page as Erich about, okay, love, it makes sense the way that he's argued it, that love is the appropriate answer to the problem of human existence, the problem of the separateness. Yeah. Then he goes to the love between a parent and a child, and we'll start on 31. The experience of being loved by a mother is a passive one. There's nothing I have to do in order to be loved by a mother's unconditional love. It cannot be acquired, produced, or controlled. It is as if it's there like a blessing. If it's not there, it is as if all beauty had gone out of life, and there's nothing I can do to create it. For most children, before the age of 8, or from the age of 8 to 10, before the age of 8 and a half to 10, The problem is almost exclusively that of being loved for what one is. The child up to this age does not yet love. He responds only gratefully to being loved. At this point of the child's development, a new factor enters into the picture, that of a new feeling, of producing love by one's own activity. For the first time, the child thinks of giving something to the mother or father, of producing something, a poem, a drawing, whatever it may be. For the first time in the child's life, the idea of love is transformed from being loved into loving, into creating love. Then a bit further down, the mother loves the newborn infant because it is her child, not because the child has fulfilled any specific condition or lived up to any specific expectation. And then he gives a caveat here, which I think is important, because I think without this caveat, I would probably disagree with him. Of course, when I speak, and he says, of course, when I speak here of a mother and father's love, I speak of ideal types in Max Weber's sense of an archetype, or in Jung's sense, or of an archetype in Jung's sense, and do not imply that every mother or father loves in this way. So he's just basically saying that, like, this is the way that it generally happens from his understanding. So mothers, and this kind of ties into what you were saying right in the beginning, Peter, mothers being this unconditional form of love, and then he goes on to say this. The relation, and this is on 33, the relationship to the father is quite different. Mother is home where we come from. Father does not represent any such natural home. He has little connection with the child in the first years of life, and his importance for the child in this early period cannot be compared with that of the mother. I think it's a bit of a harsh way of phrasing it, but generally it kind of makes some sense in the archetypal view. But while the father does not represent the natural world, he represents the pole of human existence, the world of thought, of man-made things, of law and order, of discipline, of travel, adventure. Father is one who teaches the child, who shows him the road into the world. And then he carries on 34. Fatherly love is conditional love. That's, again, something that I want to hold back and say no, but this and that, but sort of carrying on with his sort of thought process. And he says here, since his love is conditioned, I can do something to acquire it, which is different from motherly love. So he says, I can work for it. His love is not outside of my control, as motherly love is. Then a little bit further down, the infant needs mother's unconditional love and care, psychologically as well as physically. The child after 6 begins to need the father's love, his authority and guidance. The mother has the function of making him secure in life. The father has the function of teaching him, guiding him to cope with those problems with which particular society the child has been born into confronts him. The mother should have, a little bit further down, the mother should have faith in life, hence not be overly anxious, and thus not infect the child with her anxiety. The father's love should be guided by principles and expectations. It should be patient and tolerant rather than threatening and totalitarian. Eventually, the mature person has come to the point where he is his own mother and his own father. He is, as it were, a motherly and he has, as it were, a motherly and fatherly conscience. And then on 35, furthermore, the mature person loves with both the motherly and fatherly conscience, in spite of the fact that they seem to contradict each other. If he would only retain his fatherly conscience, he would become harsh and inhumane. If he would only retain his motherly conscience, he would be apt to lose judgment and hinder himself and others in their development. Yeah. So I think it's an interesting way of viewing it. And I don't know that I can fully agree with it, but I think it's a helpful sort of analogy, and I think women generally are a little bit more soft and more nurturing, whereas men can be more like, I want to do something and achieve something. But again, there's nuance with everything. What are your...
Yeah, no, I agree, and I mean, I think I did speak quite a bit into this at the beginning, like you said. How, yeah, it was just interesting trying to see the different contrasts, you know. But again, like you've said, you know, as a person, you actually need to then possess both, you know, ways. But
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there will be those instances where one overpowers the other. But I think it's just a matter of actually maintaining the right balance, you know, at the end of the day. Yeah.
Cool. Then let's go on to the objects of love. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to go through them, but I'm going to kind of skip over the bulk of them just for the sake of time. Skip over the details of each of them. So the objects of love, and we start on page 36. Love is not primarily a relationship to a specific person. It is an attitude, an orientation of character which determines the readiness of a person to the world as a whole, not towards one object of love. If a person loves only one other person and is indifferent to the rest of his fellow man, his love is not love, but a symbiotic attachment or an enlarged egotism. Then on page 37, saying that love is an orientation which refers to all and not to one does not imply, however, the idea that there are no differences between various types of love, which depend on the kind of object which is being loved. So love is according to the different object that is being loved. Man, I'm speaking in riddles. So brotherly love, and he says here, this is the most fundamental kind of love which underlies all other types of love. By this, I mean the sense of responsibility, care, respect, and knowledge of any other human being, the wish to further his life. And then he says here, which is interesting nuance, brotherly love is love for all human beings. It is characterized by its very lack of exclusiveness. Then I'm going to skip over a bunch of things, and then motherly love. It says here on page 38, motherly love, as I said previously, is the unconditional affirmation of the child's life and needs. And then he basically gives a caveat as well of saying it's not just about that, it's also about the mother basically instilling joy and happiness and desire for life. And the way that the mother needs to do that is by having that same desire and joy for life. By having that, the child learns that. And he says that that's one of the most important parts. Then on page 40, he wraps up the section of motherly love with this. But the child must grow, it must emerge from the mother's womb. It must eventually become a completely separate human being. The very existence of motherly love is to care for the growth of the child, and that means to want the child's separation from her. Here lies in the basic difference between erotic love. In erotic love, two people who are separate become one. In motherly love, two people who were one become separate. The mother must not only tolerate, she must wish and support the child's separation. It is only at this stage that motherly love becomes such a difficult task that it requires unselfishness, the ability to give everything and to want nothing but the happiness of the loved one. It is also at this stage many mothers fail in their task of motherly love. Only the really loving woman, the woman who is happier in giving than taking, who is firmly rooted in her own existence, can be a loving mother when the child is in the process of separation. Yeah, I think that's a very helpful and important point. Then erotic love on page 43. He says, yeah, because sexual desire is in the minds of most people coupled with the idea of love, they are easily misled to conclude that they love each other when they want each other physically. If the desire for physical union is not stimulated by love, if it is not a form of brotherly love, or like care in some sense, it never leads to union. It never leads to a true union in more than the what term did I use? Or it says here, in more than the orgiastic transitory sense. Or what the term that I used was euphoric, yeah. So basically, if you, maybe a simple way of putting it is, if you aren't friends with your partner, then it's that love is going to be just that euphoric union and nothing more than that. Which, importantly, going back to how he thought through the idea of euphoric union, those euphoric states, they are transitory, right? They aren't permanent. So if you don't have that sort of deeper love, then yeah, it's won't be sort of it won't fulfill that separation in a more sustainable way. Then on 44, inasmuch as we were all one, we can love everybody in the same way and in the sense of brotherly love. But inasmuch as we are also different, erotic love requires a certain specific, highly individual elements which can exist between some people, but not all. Both views, then, that of erotic love as completely individual, of a completely individual attraction, unique between two specific persons, as well as the other view that it is nothing but an act of the will, are true. So the sort of background there is he goes on this description of how you have those cases where the marriage is an organized marriage, and then you have two people that kind of put in the marriage, and the idea is that they will learn to love each other. And then you have the modern sort of idea of like falling in love and finding the perfect person and that. And there's what the danger is you can argue to say, no, love is actually that first thing. It can only be, if you were to choose two random people and to put them together, if they were truly loving people, they would be able to be in a wonderful union. And then the other extreme is to say, no, you can't just put two random people. It has to be the perfect two people that you put together. And Fromm is saying that what he thinks is it's neither of those two. It's actually both of them. Like there's this paradoxical element of certain people are almost more compatible, but at the same time, if you are truly loving, you should be able to love anyone. And the idea of love and marriage and things like that is kind of somehow dealing with this paradox. Yeah. So that is that one. Then the last one is self-love on page 45. It's a widespread belief that while it is virtuous to love others, it is sinful to love oneself. It is assumed to the degree that which I love myself, I do not love others, that the self is the same as selfishness. And then on page 46 he says, the logical fallacy in the notion that love for others and love for oneself are mutually exclusive should be stressed. If it is a virtue to love my neighbor as a human being, it must be a virtue, not a vice, to love myself, since I am a human being too. And then he touches on what is the idea of selfishness and how does it differ. And he basically says, selfishness and self-love are far from being identical. They're actually opposites. The selfish person does not love himself too much, but too little. He in fact hates himself. And then he goes on to explain how it's the selfish person that's trying to almost cope with the fact that they don't like themselves, and that's what ends up making them selfish. So basically his conclusion is that loving yourself, if you are able to do it correctly, that's a sign of the fact that you are able to actually love. And if you can't do it correctly, you actually aren't able to truly love, because there's something broken with the way that you are loving. And then he gives a quote here from Meister Eckhart on page 49. If you love yourself, you love everybody else as you do yourself. As long as you love another person less than you love yourself, you will not really succeed in loving yourself. So it's just another way of sort of saying the same general idea of loving another person correctly means that you will love yourself, and vice versa. Loving yourself correctly means that you will be able to love another person. And then lastly, love of God. So this one, I'm just going to give a very high level thing. So he says here, in all theistic religions, whether they are this is on page 50. In all theistic religions, whether they are polytheistic or monotheistic, God stands for the highest value, the most desirable good. Hence, the specific meaning of God depends on what is the most desired good for a person. The understanding of the concept of God must therefore start with the analysis of the character of the structure of the person who worships God. So I don't know that I necessarily agree with this, but his point is basically that the way, and I think there's an element of truth to it, the way that we define what it means to, what the love of God means, depends on how you understand, I guess, God and all of that. Then if we jump to page 61, he says the conclusion, so this is his conclusion, the conclusion that the love of God is neither knowledge of God in thought nor thought of one's love of God, but the act of experiencing oneness with God. This leads to the emphasis on the right way of living. And then he says, this can clearly be seen in Oriental religions, in Brahmanism, as well as Buddhism and Taoism. The ultimate aim of religion is not right belief, but right action. So, again, whether you disagree with it or not, that's the way that he is saying his conclusion is that the love of God results in right action, is what he is kind of concluding. And then, he gives a whole bunch of things, and if you want to read more on it, then you can, but there's a lot of detail there. And then he says on page 64, kind of as a conclusion to that part, one thing is certain, the nature of his love for God corresponds to the nature of his love for man, which I think makes sense. Even if you agree or disagree with him, I think that part does make sense, that the way that you understand the love of God affects how you love others. Okay, I don't know if you have any comments there. I know that we are squeezed for time.
Yeah. No, I do. But I think I'll just select a few. I think you didn't read through it, and if I remember correctly, there was also what your relationship with God also influences that love of God. Your understanding of it, which was quite interesting. And it's something that I think years ago we spoke about, like, a church, the whole thing of and I think like the circles you sort of go around to be like, the whole, if he's a loving God, then if I do something wrong, I can come back, and as opposed to, because he's a loving God, I should respect, and again, it goes back to those factors about respect, knowledge, and other. You should respect God enough to be like, oh, I shouldn't actually do that. So again, I guess the whole how the love of God also influences action. To be like, because you know God loves you, and because of how you see Him, you should make sure you always do right by Him. You know,
Mm.
again, not doing right, but yeah, sort of. I think you get what I'm trying to get at. So that was an interesting take, and again, like I said, I mean, that was the section that I think he spent the most time.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of depth there, and I mean, even like it kind of says, even depending on the different religions and stuff, but ultimately there is that love of a God, whatever religion you sort of belong to, which is also, I mean, something I've always known, but like an interesting take to it. That, and I mean, we always, at the end of the day, like I've been part of like outreach programs and stuff where we kind of say like, it's, again, this is like, as much as you'd be like someone's lost, but the ultimate, you know goal at the end is to be loved by God. Like, let's say if they're not Christian, all that, and it's about how you kind of convey that message to them, and for them to be in standing with that. But yeah, that's what I wanted to add up on that. And then there was the self love one. I think was also very interesting to me, to be like,
Yeah, me
so
too.
often, like, and I also feel like that's one thing that's used incorrectly. People have a tendency of trying to justify their actions. And I know I've been interested. I was speaking a lot with friends recently about this, to be like, you almost always justify your bad actions. In a way,
Yeah.
you can do something bad, and on Sunday, and I mean, you spoke about it here, and I wanted to tag on it, but I was like, okay, probably I'll speak about it. But the whole thing of uh, integrity, to be like,
Yeah.
you have the motive for something is to be stay true, and again, I mean, we're both Christians, and like our motives have to be aligned with God. They have to be in the best interest of others. But so often people will look at the outcome as good, but and then they'll sugarcoat what actions they've taken to achieve that. So they might want good for themselves, but in essence, okay, for instance, like if I want to rise to the top, let's say we work for the same company, I know that if I sabotage whatever it is you're doing will make me rise, I will use like, oh, the end goal is just me rising, and that would be a justification of whatever wrong actions or whatever it is that I did to get there. And again, which goes back to people want to go on about, oh, self love, wada. But in essence, it's like just being selfish to the core, because it's like, how are you? And I mean, even in relationship, people will be like, "Oh, I want some time to myself to recharge." But it's like, inwardly, to be like, it's you're making it about you. It's like, and everyone will come up with an excuse, but in essence, it's like you're supposed to actually grow together. Be in that space of, again, if you feel like the person you're with is draining you, then I think it's high time that you cut your losses and move on. So
Mm.
yeah, the whole self love and selfishness was, yeah, a very interesting take. I think so often people try to sugarcoat their selfishness as self love, which, yeah, it's very tragic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then we go to the other extreme to say, therefore, self-love is bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, which
But you're
I,
not
th-
doing
I
it correctly. It's because you're actually not loving yourself correctly, because what you
yeah,
think self love is, actually, that's
yeah,
what
it's
I'm saying. It's
distorted.
the misuse of the term,
Yeah, yeah,
is and again, which leads to the conclusion of no, loving yourself, but it's because you haven't sat down to understand what self-love entails and what the result of it is. But
But
yeah.
that's why I really like the beginning, the way that he opens the book, of that idea where it's about your whole character. Like, basically, if you were to ask him, can you be loving if you are like truly loving, if you have all of these like character flaws, like you narcissistic, so you're not looking towards others, and you not objective about situations, and you care about this person far more than that person. Obviously there's elements of nuance there as well, but if you have these sort of issues, for lack of a better term, it seems like Fromm would say, well, like maybe you're making your way towards becoming a loving person, but you aren't a truly loving person, because a truly loving person, his whole character is loving. He's able to love himself as well as correctly, as well as the other, and yeah. So I like that framing
you know
of the whole
the,
character.
and the one thing that and I know this is probably different, probably like a sidetrack from what we're discussing, but I feel relevant. It is quite relevant. I think it was spoken. There was a way I wanted to tie it into something that we said, but it's the whole. Yeah, it is on the self love thing. We or rather, the one thing that we usually, what bothers us about other people and that we love is actually usually what our shortcomings are, because that's what you're able to identify with them, but it's the core essence of the things that you don't love about yourself, which was what was interesting about what selfishness is about. Is we think people are doing things to better themselves, but actually it's like they're fighting an internal battle with something they don't like about
Yeah,
themselves, and they
yeah.
act a certain way. And yeah, I think that was, and again, with some of the conversations I've been having, and yeah, with reading part, it was quite interesting, and it's come up a few times, really in the last month or so, to be like, and I think at first, I think I'm still struggling with it, but kind of getting to terms with it, to be like, when you're in a situation and someone's being overly critical about something, the chances are they're struggling with that, but you know, are then turning the wheels on you, which is again rather selfish, but it's a reality of it. That just shows how much someone doesn't love themselves, because if you see those flaws, into someone, if you really truly love them, it's about then what is it that I can do to better the next person, you know, as I better myself through it as well. I mean, it did say somewhere like one of the core fundamentals of loving is caring for others, like thinking about others as you think of yourself. Yeah.
Again, for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip over the love and its disintegration in contemporary Western society. So that's a whole section or chapter. But the kind of high level summary of it is modern society is very consumeristic, and so love ends up being similar to that. And yeah, you can read the details if you want. Then the last chapter, I've got quite a few little notes here, but the last chapter is the practice of love. And so I've kind of broken it into three little parts. The first is what we need for the practice of any art. So any art sort of needs certain things, and love is one of those. Love is an art, and so it needs these two. And so on page 84, so it's the practice of love. Having dealt with the theoretical aspect of the art of loving, we are now confronted with a much more difficult problem, that of the practice of loving, of the art of loving. Can anything be learnt about the practice of the art except by practicing it? And then he says, the difficulty of the problem is enhanced by the fact that most people today, and hence many readers of this book, expect to be given prescriptions of how to do it yourself, and that means in our case to be taught how to love. And I'm afraid anyone who approaches it in this manner will be gravely disappointed. Then he carries on, what the discussion of practice of love can do is to discuss the premises of the art of loving, the approaches to it, as it were. The practice of any art has certain general requirements. First of all, and now he lists, I think it's 4 different things. So he says, first of all, the practice of art requires discipline. But the problem is not only that the discipline in practice of the particular art, but it is the discipline in the whole of one's life. So it's not just for the particular art like loving, but you have to become a loving person in whole. Then a bit further down, the second one is concentration. So concentration is a necessary condition for the mastery of any art, and it is hardly necessary to prove. Anyone who has ever tried to learn art knows this. Yet even more than self-discipline, concentration is rare in our culture. And then he gives lots of different things, which is very interesting because a lot of them he mentions are kind of the reminiscent of how mobile phones are now used today, or YouTube and TV series, etc. And at that time, phones didn't exist, from what I understand. Then he says a third is patience. Again, anyone who's ever tried to master the art of patience knows that. Master an art knows that patience is necessary if you want to achieve anything. If one is quick after results, one never learns an art. Yet for modern man, patience is difficult to practice, as discipline is difficult, and concentration. A whole industrial system fosters exactly the opposite, quickness. Then he carries on to point 4. The condition of learning any art eventually a condition of learning any art is a supreme concern with mastery of the art. So you not only need to have discipline and concentration and patience, but you need to have a focus, like a supreme focus on that particular mastery of art. So if you want to become a doctor, you almost need to be consumed with the studying of it, being a doctor, and thinking about it and talking about it, and etc. Same with software developer or anything. And he's saying that love is no different. Yeah, he gives a few different details of discipline and concentration, and how concentration is difficult to practice in our culture. Yeah, but I don't think there's anything super important to read there. Yeah, then let me go to page 92. So on page 92, so those were kind of the things that need to be practiced for the art of loving. And then he talks now about qualities which are of specific significance for the ability to love. So not just in general, but the specific art of loving. And he says on 92, the main condition for the achievement of love is overcoming one's narcissism. And he says the opposite pole to narcissism is objectivity. It is the faculty to see people and things as they are, objectively, and to be able to separate this objective picture from a picture which is formed by one's desires and fears. Then on page 94, the faculty to think objectively is reason. The emotional attitude behind reason is that of humility. To be objective, to use one's reason, is possible only if one has achieved an attitude of humility. One has emerged from the dreams of omniscience and omnipotence, which one has as a child. And then on page 95, the practice of the art of loving requires the practice of faith, what he calls a rational faith. And he says a bit further down, rational faith is not primarily a belief in something, but a quality of a certain and firm conviction that we have. Faith is a character trait pervading the whole personality rather than a specific belief. Then on page 96, in the sphere of human relations, faith is indispensable as a quality of any significant friendship or love. Having faith in another person means to be certain or trust that in the reliability and unchangeability of that person's fundamental attitudes and the core of that person's personality, their love. A little bit further down, only a person who has faith in himself is able to be faithful to others, because he can be sure that he will be the same in the future as he is today, and therefore that he will feel and act as he expects to act. And then page 98. To have faith requires courage, the ability to take risk, the readiness to even accept pain and disappointment. Whoever insists on safety and security as a primary condition for life cannot have faith. To be loved and to love need courage, the courage to judge certain values of ultimate concern and to take the jump and stake everything on those values. And then a bit further down, is there anything to be practiced about faith and courage? So this is interesting because I wouldn't have thought that the answer would be yes here. And he says, indeed, faith can be practiced at every moment. It takes faith to bring up a child. It takes faith to fall asleep. It takes faith to begin any work. But we're all accustomed to having these kinds of faith. However, if one does not have it, one suffers from over-anxiety about their child or insomnia, or from the inability to do any productive work. To stick to one's judgment about a person, even if public opinion or some unforeseen facts seem to invalidate it, to stick to one's convictions even though they are unpopular, all this requires faith and courage. And then page 100, to love means to commit to oneself without a guarantee, to give oneself completely in the hope that our love will produce love in the other person. Love is an act of faith, and whoever is of little faith is also of little love. And then lastly, the capacity to love demands a state of intensity and awakeness, enhanced vitality, which can be the result of a productive and active orientation in many other spheres of life. If one is not productive in other spheres, one is not productive in love either. So, yeah, I know, seems like it was a little bit of a jump around. Let me just quickly get back to it. So there's the idea of objectivity. That's the one thing. So he kind of talks about these qualities, and we went on like a long little rope through them. But the qualities that he actually mentions are objectivity. So you need to be objective about situations in order to be able to love well. You need to have faith, because if you don't sort of trust and say, okay, I'm going to choose to get involved in this marriage. I mean, again, for lack of a better term, do your due diligence. But at some point you have to kind of commit and say, okay, I'm going to trust that this is going to work out. And whether that turns out badly or not, I'm going to take that leap of faith. So objectivity, faith, and then courage and faith are kind of tied together. And then he says activity as well. Like one needs to basically take action, but not just in the sphere of love, but in one's whole character and one's whole life. Yeah. then sort of maybe a conclusion wrap up is he also, and I won't read through it, but the last part of the book, he does an interesting shift to say, when we often think about love, the current society basically is set up in a way where it pushes us towards unloving things, about consumerism, etc., etc. And so when we see a truly loving person, that is an exception. And he's saying that that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. It is generally the case in current society, is his claim. But he says that society doesn't have to be that way. And what we need to do is work towards societal change to make it so that the loving orientation is the natural orientation. Whereas at the moment, it's kind of the opposite of that.
Yeah.
He doesn't say how, but he says we should try. Yeah.
I think just before we wrap up, yeah, that chapter to me was also interesting. The way how he started it, he's like, I won't give you how to practice that of loving, but these are the things that you kind of need to work on to sort of be able and truly love,
Yeah.
And I found that to be interesting, I mean, for one, like you said, I mean, you mentioned like the whole being disciplined, and again, it goes back to what I was sort of saying earlier. Again, I used the word like achieve love, but it was like what I meant was like to then become in the state of loving, you need to be able to be disciplined. And if you are able to be disciplined in any other field, you be disciplined at loving. Essentially, that's what it's kind of said. And then it goes about the concentration thing. Again, like I said, it was a book that was written a long time ago before any of these things were invented. But it's interesting to see how he said, like, we are people that want to make things efficient. Like he kind of mentioned, like we create machines to do whatever it is in half the time. We've done that because we've said we want to spare time, but the moment we have spare time, we then don't know what to do with that spare time. Which is very interesting to be like, and like what even got me like, I was like, we've become people, and I even felt some type of way, really, like not guilty of it, to be like, if I find myself at home on my own, it's like, what can I do? It's like I'll switch on the
Yeah.
TV.
I need to chill.
I
Yeah.
need to. We want to do, but when you have that moment, it's like you're reading a book. Just, and I mean, I think last week, and that was even before, it was like probably one of the first days in a while where I just sat, for a bit of time in silence, thinking through how the first 6 months of the year have gone and everything. But I'm like, yeah, like so often is like when I'm found in that, like after church, it's like, oh, what can I do? What can I watch? Where can I go? I just don't want to be home. Yeah, you need to, from time to time, just embrace that. Yeah. But yeah, it was just, you did sum it up well, and what's required of us, to love. And again, like you said, we're so surrounded of consumerism that everything is a transaction. That I think also, as people become less trusting, to be like, if you find someone that radiates love, it's like, oh, so what's the catch? Which shouldn't be the
Yeah.
case.
Yeah. I think the book as a whole, it's one of the books that I'm really glad that we chose to do it, because I don't think I would have ever finished this book if it weren't for needing to be like, okay,
Yeah,
I need to be able to speak through what's going on here.
yeah.
And I'm really glad that we did, because it's a very, like we said, it's a very difficult read, but there's lots of things that are just, they're worthwhile reflecting on and thinking about. And again, I don't think any of them are revolutionary,
Yeah.
but just being reminded of things like what you're saying now in the ending chapters of discipline and concentration and patience, and those kind of things are needed, and one needs to foster them in one's character in order to be able to be a more loving person. And those are difficult things to do, but to be aware of it and to be like, oh, okay, I can take those steps towards that. I can take steps to being more objective, to having faith, and to taking action. And yeah, I think as a whole, yeah, I'm very glad that we read it and chatted through it. Cool. Thanks, Peter.
No, thanks,
I
James.
guess until next time then.
Yeah. Cool. Cheers.
Cool.